Good morning, and I'd like to start by thanking the organizers of the conference, particularly Radwan Masmoudi for his invitation and for organizing this event. I have been asked to talk about some of what I would consider to be the typical conflicts, the typical problems that arise in all transitions. And I'm talking about this not with the idea that all transitions are the same and that it is possible to take lessons from one country and to apply verbatim in another country because nothing could be further from the truth, but it is worthwhile reflecting on essentially what is typical in a period of transition. I think too often each country looks at its own transition and the problems of the transitions as there was something unique to that particular situation. And the point is that they are not. That all transitions experience a certain set of problems. And the first problem that they all face, all transitions face, is that they are very rarely smooth. In other words, there is no such thing as a transition from authoritarian to democracy, or even more broadly, from one political system to another political system that does not lead to a great deal of conflict, and not necessarily violence, not necessarily armed conflict, but certainly conflict, because all transitions make winners and losers, produce winners and losers. And very importantly, the losers lose immediately, while the winners usually win in the long term, or the majority of the winners win in the long term only. You could argue that in a successful democratic transition, everybody wins in the long run. That at some point you come out with a system that really benefits everybody. But the fact is that this is not the case in the short term. There were people who were in power, who are no longer in power. There were people who were accustomed to a certain political and social systems and felt relatively comfortable with it, even if they did not really like it. They knew what to expect from it. They all of a sudden feel extremely insecure, extremely uncertain because of what might happen, even if it has not happened yet, and there is no uncertainty that will happen. So let me talk briefly about what are some of the most typical conflicts that we see in these transitions, and then what has been the outcome in some of the countries, if possible, to try to draw some conclusions from that. First of all, I think in all transitions there is a clash of visions. There is a clash of ideas about what kind of political system, what kind of economic system, what kind of reforms you want to implement. And very often, and I think this is a point that we disregard far too often, there is also this conflict of visions. It's also accompanied by a conflict between two elites that represent a different social strata of the population. You see it very clearly, for example, in the transition in Egypt at the present time, when you not only have the conflict between secularists and Islamists, it's in fact a conflict between an old elite and a new rising elite. It's not just a question of ideas, it's also a question of social background, it's a question of economic interest, it's a question of culture and education. The second problem that you have, the second conflict that you have, or set of conflicts, I should say, that you have in all these transitions is what I would call is a conflict of legitimacy. Because in a stable political system, in a political system that has been established for a long time, you have a overlapping, I would say, of legitimacy and legality. In other words, there is a set of laws that may not be very good laws, but there is always a set of laws that essentially justifies and provides legitimacy for the distribution of power that exists. In a transition, particularly in a transition as rapid as the one, as those that are taking place in Arab countries now, Tunisian transition, the Egyptian transition, even more so in Libya where you have a military overthrow of an existing government. All of a sudden, legitimacy and legality become totally divorced. In other words, the laws in theory say one thing, that in terms of the distribution of power, who has right to what, the legitimacy no longer corresponds to that, because the old laws, the old system is no longer accepted to a large part of the population. So that essentially there is a limbo, there is a transitional period where legality and legitimacy do not correspond. People talk a lot in these cases of revolutionary legitimacy. Well, what is revolutionary legitimacy? And I think the problem with that is that it's very much in the eye of the beholder. I'm not saying, I don't think that there is a possibility of having a real transition without this rejection of the old legitimacy and the old legality and the putting in place of a new one. But in the interim, I think legitimacy is divorced from legality, and it's very much in the eyes of the beholder. And one very interesting example, one place where you see that very clearly, I think there may be an element of that in Tunisia, but it's much more clear in the case of Morocco, excuse me, in the case of Egypt, where you have a legality that is being pursued by the courts, and the legitimacy that comes from the elections and from the street movements. So that in the end, you have this paradoxical situation of an elected parliament being unconstitutional by courts on the basis of laws of a constitution that was already abrogated. So that there is a real clash of legitimacy and legality. I'm not trying to say that one is wrong and the other one is right. I don't want to say whether the courts were right to disband the parliament in Egypt. That is a discussion that does not belong in this panel. But just pointing out that there is this clash of the legitimate and legality happens in all transitions, essentially. One way of putting that is that you cannot make an omelette without breaking the eggs. You have to break the egg of the old legality in order to get not only to new legitimacy, but eventually to new legality that reflects the change that's taking place. Finally, and very importantly, there is a clash of among the power ambitions. In other words, what a period of transition does, it opens up possibility. It makes it possible for people who could never have aspired to be in position of powers before, to aspire to be in position of powers. In other words, a period of transition is a period of particularly acute struggle for power, and that struggle for power can be animated by high principles, by lofty goals, and very much by personal ambitions, and all these things that get really confused if you want. And finally, and I think this may be worthwhile mentioning, in the context of the Arab transitions, there is conflict of experience. In other words, one of the problems in setting up a new government is, yes, you need to bring, in a transition period, yes, you have to bring new blood, you have to bring new ideas, otherwise there is not going to be a transition. But the people who come in as a result of the change are people who by definition are not having experience. We hear the accusation of incompetence all the time. You hear it in Tunisia, you hear it in Egypt, you hear it everywhere. And by the way, you heard it in the Eastern European countries, in the Central Asian countries. It's not just an Arab phenomenon, because people who were excluded from power in the past, by definition, don't have much experience in running a country. So that again, there is a real dilemma on how to overcome those problems. Very briefly, let me mention some of the examples of, first mention some countries where, that illustrate some of these I'll start first of all with what I consider to be the most tragic example of a sort of a resolution of these conflicts that cost a great deal, not only to the countries involved, but to the rest of the world. And these are the transitions in Germany and Italy in the period after World War I, with the rise of fascists and Nazis. You had the same conflict of ideologies. Don't forget that the rise of fascism and rising came in the context of the rise of socialist parties. That what you find in all these countries is socialist parties that were about to win the elections. Or none of them had actually won the majority in the election. But if you look at the elections in these countries, for a period of 10, 15 years, even successive elections, the socialist parties were closer to gaining more and more, and then created this violent reaction of the rise of the fascist parties and the Nazi parties, and everybody knows the outcome of that. What happened there is that this conflict of vision, essentially, was taken outside the electoral arena and was taken to the streets. And in the end, both sides took it to the streets, and you had militias on all sides. You had violence both on the side of the socialists and of the fascist parties. In the end, the stronger prevailed. And the Nazi party, the fascist parties were better organized. They had more contacts in terms of financing to the people who had, to the industrialists in this country, to the military, and so on. And the result was the disaster that hit these countries and hit the rest of Europe. So this is eventually, perhaps if there is a little hope in there, is let's not forget that in the end these countries became democratic, but it took a very, very bad hiatus before this could happen. Coming closer to us, I'd like to mention briefly the post-Soviet transitions. And the post-Soviet transitions are interesting because, I think I skipped the post-Soviet transitions because, and I talk briefly about something which is closer to Tunisia, which is the case of Turkey. Because Turkey is a very interesting example because, people talk a lot about Turkey as a model. There is a panel this afternoon that is going to talk about Turkey as a model. But don't forget that the first transition in Turkey was a very unsuccessful transition. And the second transition is not over yet. But what I mean by the first transition was the election of Erbakan, and the first Islamist party to come to power, and that was a party that came to power with a rather maximalist agenda, essentially, and perhaps it's a very naive approach to politics, try to implement, to change too many things too much, to try to shove this vision, this different vision, far too fast on the country, and the result was a military, not exactly a military coup d'etat. The Turks have mastered the art of the coup d'etat, which is not always openly a coup d'etat, but essentially was the banning of Erbakan's party, the going back to essentially to the regime for all practical purposes, and only later you had a second return with an Islamist party, the AKP, coming to power, which is, if you want, in a much subdued condition. If you want, the first Erbakan was a virus, and the AKP was the virus that would be attenuated so that people can be given a vaccination. But it still hurts, but it does not quite. It's not seen as dangerous as the disease itself. That transition has been unfolding now over a period of 10 years. It has unfolded through the struggle between the old state, and here you have the fight of legitimacies that you see very clear, between the legitimacy, the struggle between the legitimate that comes from the new elections, and the fight of with the legitimacy that comes from the old laws, the old institutions that were in place. And this is the struggle that has often been described as the struggle between the the deep state, which is an expression that I see used in the case of the Arab transitions more and more. Before the moderator comes and drives me away, let me just briefly say, so what is the, what are the conclusions that we can reach here? And I leave those conclusions really broad, because I said I don't want to say these are precise lessons that have been taken from one country and transferred to another. But I think two things are important. One, to keep in mind that the existence of these conflicts, and there are certain conflicts that exist in Tunisian response. We have heard two somewhat different visions this morning, and of course in the political discourse, the divisions are much more acute than what is expressed in an arena of this sort. The existence of those conflicts is to be expected. In other words, it's not a reason for despair. It's not a reason to say, well, all countries have conflicts and therefore there is no problem. Just saying, this is just a phase. You cannot get to a transition without experiencing those problems. And the second one is that the second takeaway, if you want, is that the way in which those conflicts are handled, you really determine in the end the outcome. So that, for example, in the case of Turkey, trying to push for change too fast, too quickly, may very well lead to the failure of a transition. Let me add a footnote that not pushing for change fast enough also can lead to a failure of the transition. So let me leave it at that.